Hi guys, it is August 16th and fulfilling a promise that I made on Facebook to do a review of the movie The Witch. The Witch was released in 2016 and I watched it probably a couple years ago. It was released in 2015. I watched it a couple years ago and I really enjoyed it. It's funny how when you watch something the first time, certain aspects of the movie strike you, and it's those aspects that you focus on and you think, well, you don't think, but you sort of remember as being the whole point of the movie, or at least the central features and so on. So I watched it for a second time last night, and it's funny, it didn't strike me the same way as quite the same movie. I enjoyed it both times. In fact, I think I enjoyed it even more the second time. So I don't know what I'd rate the movie as. Well, let me put it this way. I'm extremely picky about movies. 90% of movies I hate and will never look at, will never give time to. And those I like, I really like. Those I love. So The Witch is definitely a movie I recommend. I recommend to adults. It's definitely not appropriate for children. It's not appropriate for children, I wouldn't say, for the reasons that the censors give. The censors say something like graphic nudity. There was no graphic nudity. There was nudity, but it wasn't graphic. So there was no genitals shown, no nipples, horrible nipples shown, but there were naked bodies sort of from a distance and not showing their nasty bits. Okay, so I think the expression graphic nudity is mistaken, but it is a very somber movie. It's, even if kids watched it, they wouldn't find it interesting. They would find it, well, they'd find it scary, and they'd also find it boring, I think. It is a pretty dark movie. Now, I don't like that term dark. Dark can mean a lot of things. I like the movie. Again, thumbs up, 2 thumbs up, 8 out of 10, something like that, 4 out of 5. Let's talk a little bit about it. Why do I like it? Well, it's a historical piece, and it's very, it works very hard to be historically accurate. Whether it succeeds or not is up to you to decide. It passes muster with me in many ways. Well, one of the first things that struck me in watching it this second time were some of the initial scenes. They look almost like they were out of a Rembrandt painting or a Vermeer painting. So this is the epoch that we're talking about here. It's set in, it doesn't pinpoint it, the movie doesn't pinpoint where it's set, but you get the impression that it's New Englandish area, original 13 colonies, New Englandy area, and it's very early. It's the Puritan settlers, so we're talking about 17th century, and again, dressed in the garb of people from Rembrandt's paintings, then it's definitely 17th century, early 17th century, mid 17th century. Beautiful cinematography, luscious in a sense that the texture's beautiful. I guess I'll give some spoilers, and maybe a great number of spoilers. I won't get into the nitty-gritty details of the plot, I don't think too much, but I just want to talk about the virtues and vices of the movie, perhaps. One of the things that I liked about this movie right away, and this was my first viewing, was that it was religious. Now, as you know, I'm a theologian. I have a PhD in theology, and I find people's conceptions of God, of religion, extremely interesting. And of course, I'm much more aware of the subtle differences between different peoples and places and churches and so on than many are. These are settlers, Puritan settlers from England. They do name that. They do say they're from England. Right away, basically, kind of the opposite of what happens in many movies. It's not the judges or the rulers of the colony who think that a certain member of their group isn't holy enough. it's the guy who doesn't think the community is holy enough. So he is kicked out of the colony. He's kicked out of their community, and he has to take his family along with him. Right away, it's a very rigid, puritanical, I guess we would say Jansenistic, Calvinistic in people. And remember, we're going back to the time of Cromwell and all these people in England. Okay, so once they're kicked out of the community, obviously the main character is the oldest daughter of this father and mother. The oldest daughter, they say she, at one point, it is said that the girl is becoming a woman, so she's whatever, 13, 14, whatever, and she's the main character, and she's beautiful, and her, very, it's funny, I was thinking about this story could have been made, about anybody. They never call her beautiful in the story. It only plays a small role in the story, her attractiveness. I was thinking about this, she's very pleasing to the eyes of the viewer, okay? And I was thinking about what purpose that plays. Well, I was thinking it makes you very sympathetic to her. And I was thinking, well, what if they didn't have such an attractive or such a pretty actress playing this role? I mean, it's hard to imagine that one would be less sympathetic to the character were they less attractive. I mean, the way that it's written, the way that the story is written, like I'm trying to think she's just beautiful, but if they had put a sort of an ordinary looking girl in that role, it's hard for me to think that any disservice would have been played. Now, looking at it cynically, I think the viewer is swept along, in the sense the male viewer is swept along thinking, ooh, I'm going to see her naked at some point. Obviously, she's a child, and so that's not the best. That's not the best when you think on a conscious level. That's not the best motivation. But I think that is part of the thing, and that's one of the things. And no, let's get right back to the center of things here. The center of things is established right away, and it's that this family has a very dark view of religion, a very Calvinistic view of God and of religion, and that's the greatness of the movie in that sense. So here's the center point, and this is what the genius of the movie consists in. It consists in, when you think about it, everything these characters think about God and the world comes about. Okay, so they think God and the world are very negative realities, and that is what comes about. So I was thinking it's less the tragedy that of this family is less, I think, directly caused by the witch. Is she really a witch? Does she exist at all? Than it is a fulfillment of their own pessimistic viewpoint. So it's funny how, you'd think maybe, for instance, a Jesuitical view of God, which is kind of the polar opposite. It's a very optimistic view of God. Someone espousing that idea, or a modern liberal idea of God and of Christianity, it couldn't have produced this kind of story. So in the end, everything these people think about God and the world is in fact what happens. So it's established right away what the family believes. Basically, we have right in the very first scene, it's the father calling the community a bunch of sinners and blah blah blah, and then they're constantly praying and blah blah blah, and there's an excursion that the father and the son and the older son make early in the movie, and the father is quizzing the son about basically his catechism. So basically, and it's always the same thing, like they concentrate always on the ubiquity of sin. Now it's an extreme Calvinism, extreme Augustinianism, whereas Catholics would say It's Jansenism. So basically, it's a focus on man's fallenness and the power and influence of sin's corruption, so original sin in the world. This contrasts very greatly with sort of as I say, a Jesuitical. I mean, Jesuitical is usually taken as a derogatory, but I'm using it in a positive sense. A Jesuitical or a Thomistic idea of man as capable of doing good and of knowing and loving God. It's all a matter of degrees. Like, no Christian, no matter what Christian in the mid 17th century would ever say that they disagree with St. Augustine's teaching on grace. St. Augustine was the centerpiece of Christian thinking on grace. He was always called the Doctor of Grace. And he had, by contrast with our modern emphasis, a very negative view of anthropology. So of what man's capable on his own, what man's free will is capable of. So it's an emphasis on the effects of original sin on people and people's ability to know the truth, to love God, to love the good. So in exchange here, in other words, it's a theocentric view where God alone is the source of good, that only in God alone can we know and love the good. Otherwise, everything we have of ourselves, of our own human nature, of our fallen human nature, is capable of sin. So this is established right away. And whereas someone like me, even in my most Augustinian days, I certainly, there's a way to be a Jansenist Augustinian and a way to be a Thomistic Augustinian. And, in the spirit is very different. The spirit is very different between the two states of being. One's dour and pessimistic, and the other is more emphasizes on the mercy and generosity of God. You acknowledge that no, human beings aren't capable of good in themselves, but God is constantly pouring out his grace on people. He's not stingy with his grace. So you can see it there how you can have the same Augustinian foundation, but a different conception of how God acts. So all good comes from God, no good comes from yourself, but God is very generous with his gifts. He's constantly pouring them out. But that's not the view of this family. That's not the view of the father primarily, and of the mother as well. So here we have basically the family's exiled from the community. They travel, they say later in the movie that they traveled for about a day away from the community, basically into the wilderness. And they stop in this sort of open field, and over the summer they kind of plant some crops. You see their corn, and they're right on the edge of this forest. Now the movie's not very subtle about sort of indicating how nefarious or malevolent the forest is. It does it sort of heavy-handedly with the music. That's one of my complaints about the movie, is it's a little heavy-handed with the music near these opening scenes. So other than that, I mean, the music starts very beautifully in the town, in the town, and during their traveling and so on. But it's once it gets to this forest that the music gets a little heavy-handed. So what you quickly realize is that the harvest doesn't go as well as, I mean, okay, they flip forward and they've got a cabin, and they've got partially erected barns and all that stuff. But then you realize you're told that the corn harvest didn't go well, that the corn rotted, and now they're kind of got to find some other ways to make it through the winter. So most of the corn is no good, and later on it's indicated that this has something to do with the witch in the area, or the evil in the area. Okay, whether you think this is subtly enough done or not, that's your judgment call. But overall, I thought it was very good. Other than, as I said, the heavy-handedness with the music there, I think it's very good in a sense. So the whole thing is, does this witch really exist? Does she not? How is she a manifestation of the family's paranoia? How is she a manifestation of the family's anxiety, their fear of having to live on their own? And how much is this a fact? Like, how much is this real? So the main girl's name is Thomasin. When she's taking care of the baby, suddenly, she's playing with it out in the field in front of the woods. Suddenly the baby disappears. And this is the first thing, and everything basically falls apart from that point. It's one disaster after another. Again, it's light-handed enough that how much is this? How much of this is really happening, and how much is not? How much is a figment of their imagination or a manifestation of their fears and of their very dark theology? So ultimately, it's a very well done movie. I think that, so the big question I always ask myself with movies like this, so I guess you would call it religious supernatural, if that makes sense, religious supernatural, is that if evil has power, so very often in these movies, good doesn't have power. And no, I don't understand that. Okay, I don't understand how that can be, and I don't understand how writers and directors can do that kind of thing. So let me give for example. In all of these movies, like let's say for example, Paranormal Activity, evil has power. There's satanic stuff. There's witches and evil powers. But where's the good powers? Okay, so if there's a devil, there has to be God, right? Doesn't there? And so in this movie, in our movie, if evil is present, is good present? If the devil's present, then where's God? I think this movie satisfactorily gets around the problem. And let me tell you what my best guess is about this. That, for instance, the older brother, who is a few years younger than Thomasin, he has he has an experience with the witch, and ultimately he dies, but he dies in a state of grace, right? His death scene is a very powerful one in the sense that he says he feels God, he sees the light and all that stuff. So for parents like this, they could ask for nothing more in the death of their child than in this apparent state of grace. So in that case, you can say, well, there's God, right? Well, the prayers of the people don't seem to work very well. God, okay, so yeah, ultimately, the ultimate thing is salvation, okay? And so Caleb is, as it appears, Caleb is saved according to these people's understanding of salvation. Caleb is saved, so that's a true victory of God. But if anything, Thomasin isn't, the father William isn't, the mother Catherine isn't, the twins, as they call them, the younger brother and sister, you're not shown what happens to them, but they were basically more open to the operation of the evil spirit than anybody. So you can say, well, if they die, and you're not shown that they do die, if they die, then they die in a bad state. So the only one who undeniably ends in a good state is Caleb. You're even told that the baby was unbaptized. So I think that's a little historically inaccurate to me. I think the family would have baptized the baby. If you are in a situation like that, out on your own, and you have a newborn baby, and there's no one around, no minister, no nobody, you would baptize the baby. And the fact that the baby dies or disappears unbaptized is historically tendentious. Okay, so that's not that part wasn't good. What's so interesting about Thomasin is she just wants to be loved. She just wants to be loved by her mother, and her mother constantly rejects her. treats her like a workhorse, is always dumping on her, and in the end, she just you realize she just wants to be loved. The last scene basically is her receiving some kind of satisfaction in the embrace of the evil of the witches or whatever. So, I mean, that final scene is open to your interpretation. It's fascinating in that way. It's fascinating how this was, and I think it's very good. Even though it's for all that, it's a tragedy. For all that, it's a very smart ending. The way that you see that she is led to the embrace of this evil, away from what her family believes, because her family is just so horrible to her. Okay, so, and it's not a horrible sort of nothing good kind of Oliver Twist kind of thing that's so like blatant. It creeps in, and you see it slowly, and you see it. Thomasin just wants to be loved by her mother, but her mother is a wreck. Especially her mother dissolves into pieces after the baby disappears, and it just goes from bad to worse for her. And the father is, well, everything's his fault, because he, bad Father of the Year award goes to William, and bad Mother of the Year award goes to Catherine. William is just, he's in a sense the epitome of a stupid, overzealous religious person, and his stupidity is sort of named in one place where Thomasin blames him for being run by his wife. Catherine's destiny is sort of understandable in that she loses her children, first her baby and then Caleb, and so she basically is hysterical and loses her mind, basically, which is understandable. It's just that, oh, and let me just say maybe one last thing, that it's so interesting that when the devil makes his appearance, and the way they do it is it's very light and suggestive and indirect. I found that the devil his voice sounds like the Father's voice, is very deep and sonorous, and it reminded me of her father. So you can see how this desire of Thomasin to be loved is the motivating force for her character's progression. So what can I say? Other than the baptism thing, I think it was very theologically astute and interesting. If you're not easily frightened or upset, then definitely watch this movie. If you like history and all that stuff, like, it's not hysterical and ridiculous like maybe The Crucible is, or some, a lot of this anti-Christian or anti-Puritan cinema is. It is much more interesting and thoughtful and psychological than that. So yeah, it gets 2 big thumbs up from me. I hope you enjoyed this video, this review of The Witch, and maybe we'll do some more soon. Thanks everybody so much. Oh yeah, and buy my book.